They say faith and science walk separate roads, one paved with prayer, the other with experiment, one rooted in hope, the other in evidence. But sometimes the two collide in ways neither can explain. In 1923, on the grounds of Willow Seminary, a modest institution tucked into the windswept countryside of Devon, the collision took the form of a man, a priest whose arrival changed everything the seminary thought it knew about doctrine, about learning, and about the delicate boundaries between belief and truth. His name was Father Gabriel Durham. To the faculty, he appeared a gift, articulate, erudite, with the kind of calm gravitas that reassured both parents and patrons that their sons would grow into disciplined men of God. To the students, however, he was something else entirely. His sermons were not gentle reminders of morality, but searing invocations that seemed to pierce bone and marrow. He spoke of sin, not as a failing but as a parasite, a living presence that clung to souls like rot in wood. He did not merely warn of hell. He described it as if he had seen its caverns with his own eyes. The boys whispered his name long after evening prayers, half in awe, half in terror. For though they admired his eloquence, they feared the way his gaze lingered, unblinking, as if he could read the private contents of their hearts. The seminary had stood for nearly 80 years by then, its corridors lined with oak paneling, its chapel ringing with hymns and candlelight. It was a place built for order, for predictability. Yet with Father Durham's arrival, something in its rhythm faltered. Discipline became fear. Reverence bent into silence. Strange accounts began to emerge among the students. One boy swore that while serving at the altar he had seen Father Durham's shadow move against the stone floor when the priest himself stood utterly still. Another claimed that in the dormitory, late at night, he heard his own name whispered, only to wake and find the priest standing at the foot of his bed, murmuring a prayer that did not belong to any scripture he had been taught. Still, the seminary dismissed such fears as childish fancies. The 1920s were years of progress, of electricity replacing oil lamps, of automobiles replacing horse carts. England wanted to believe itself moving forward, unshackled from superstition. Faith was to be disciplined, rational, respectable. And what could be more respectable than a priest with such command of scripture, such mastery of rhetoric? But then came the disappearances. At first they were small animals from the surrounding farms, dogs, cats, the occasional lamb, vanishing near the school grounds. Then weeks later, a student was found wandering the chapel at dawn, eyes vacant, lips raw from repeating the same word over and over again. Absolution. He never returned to class. His parents removed him in shame, though the seminary insisted it was illness, a sudden fever of the mind. Another boy disappeared altogether. He was last seen attending evening confession with Father Durham. His bed was found made, his trunk neatly packed away, as though he had never lived in the dormitory at all. The faculty issued statements that he had left with his family during the night, but no carriage was seen on the road. No letter came to explain his departure. He was gone, and no one spoke his name again. The atmosphere within the seminary shifted. Whispers curled like smoke through the corridors. Fathers at neighboring parishes began to remark that the boys from Willow seemed changed, withdrawn, hollow-eyed, as if carrying burdens too vast for youth. It was not only the students who faltered. Dr. Jonathan Merrick, a scholar of natural philosophy employed at the seminary, began keeping notes of his own observations. He had long argued that faith and science could coexist, that the study of anatomy, chemistry, and astronomy only deepened one's wonder at the Creator. But when Father Durham spoke, Dr. Merrick found his reason unraveling. In one lecture he swore he heard the priest recite passages not from the Bible, but from obscure alchemical texts, words no priest should know. He wrote in his diary, "If this man is holy, then holiness has taken a form I no longer recognize." He speaks of salvation as though it were not granted by grace, but wrested from something darker. I feel in his presence as though the marrow of me is weighed, measured, and found wanting. Merrick grew convinced that Father Durham was not merely a man of unusual persuasion, but something else, an interloper in a priest's skin. Yet when he attempted to confide in the rector, he was met with sharp rebuke. The seminary's coffers had swelled since Durham's arrival. Donations flowed in from patrons drawn by his reputation. His sermons filled pews with both locals and travelers. To question him was to jeopardize the institution's prosperity. And so Merrick kept silent, his only resistance the ink that darkened the pages of his journal. But silence cannot shield forever. The students began reporting dreams. Night after night they saw the priest standing not at the pulpit, but at the threshold of their beds, his hands clasped in prayer. Some woke screaming. Others did not wake at all, but rose in sleep, wandering into the chapel where they knelt until dawn, lips moving in prayers no one had taught them. By spring of 1923, Willow Seminary was no longer a place of learning, nor of worship. It had become a vessel, an instrument for something unseen, its corridors thick with dread, its chapel filled not with hymns but with murmurs. What disturbed Merrick most was this: he too began to dream, not of Durham himself, but of the seminary as a whole, its stones soft as flesh, its doors breathing, its windows blinking like eyes. And in every dream, he stood before the altar, unable to move, as a voice whispered, "Proof and faith are one." When he woke, the words were carved into the margin of his notebook in his own hand, though he remembered writing nothing. By the end of that spring, both faith and science had begun to fail. For how could either explain a man who spoke with such authority that even reason itself bent to him? And so the first chapter of this story closes not with answers, but with a question. If faith binds us to what we cannot see, and science to what we can, what do we call a man who stands between both and bends them to his will? Willow Seminary was not a place for the faint of heart. It rose from the rolling countryside of Yorkshire like a monolith of discipline, its spires stabbing through the mist, its blackened stones scarred by centuries of rain and soot. To the locals, the school was as much fortress as sanctuary, a place where boys were shaped into men through equal measures of scripture and science. Within its vaulted halls, theology and medicine, philosophy and chemistry, Latin and mathematics collided, each treated as sacred roads to truth. It was said that Willow was where faith and reason learned to coexist, though not always peacefully. In the winter of 1923, as the moors lay buried beneath fog and the chapel bells tolled like warnings in the mist, a new figure stepped through its iron gates. His name was Father Mathieu Armand, a visiting priest from France, summoned to lecture on spiritual philosophy. The invitation had come quietly, whispered among the faculty. Willow often welcomed foreign lecturers, yet few arrived under such a cloud of speculation. Even before his carriage rolled into the courtyard, there were rumors that he had once taught in Paris, but left abruptly under unclear circumstances, that he had served as confessor to a family whose name no one dared repeat, that he had preached sermons in cathedrals where the faithful wept not from devotion, but from dread. When he appeared, he seemed to confirm every rumor and deepen them still. He was tall, unnaturally so, his frame draped in a black cassock that clung to his gauntness. His eyes, two voids the color of ash, seemed both hollow and endless, like windows to a depth no one should look into for long. His hair was streaked with gray, though he could not have been more than 40. His face was not cruel, nor warm, but something in between, a visage stripped of humanity's easy signals. The effect was immediate. Faculty members trained to the habits of composure found themselves uneasy in his presence. Some claimed that his handshake lingered too long, that his palms were too cold, that his voice, though smooth and articulate, seemed to vibrate inside the ear like a whisper half spoken by someone else. The students were less disciplined in their reactions. Some fell into reverence, drawn to the strange gravity that clung to him. Others grew restless in his sermons, their stomachs turning, as though his words pressed against something buried deep within them. But no one could ignore him. Among the seminarians was Thomas Hale, a young man devoted not only to scripture but to medicine. His father, a physician in Leeds, had urged him to balance his calling to priesthood with the discipline of science, to learn how faith and reason might serve one another rather than divide. Hale was earnest, curious, and hungry for knowledge. And when Father Mathieu entered Willow, Hale felt a fascination he could not shake. At first it seemed only admiration for a learned man. Armand's lectures spoke of the soul not as a concept, but as substance, a force as real as air, measurable if one only possessed the right instruments. He quoted Aquinas and Pascal with ease, yet just as fluidly referenced philosophers of doubt. He suggested that sin might leave traces in the flesh, that grace might alter the rhythm of the blood. To Hale, caught between dissection tables and scripture, this was intoxicating. But soon subtler signs revealed themselves. In Armand's chambers, clocks faltered, pendulums slowed, then sped, as if uncertain of their allegiance to time. A pocket watch, laid on his desk, ticked backward for several minutes, before resuming its march as though nothing had happened. Animals avoided him. The seminary's hounds, loyal to every faculty member, cowered when he approached, their hackles rising though he never raised a hand. Birds that perched on the chapel windows fled the moment he stepped into the pulpit. Even the horses that drew his carriage had balked before the gates, requiring force to bring them through. The boys whispered. They spoke of strange smells, iron and incense, lingering in the halls after he passed. They said the candles on the altar burned lower when he spoke, as though starved of air. One evening, after a boy mocked Armand's accent behind closed doors, laughter turned to coughing. By morning the boy lay feverish, his body racked with pain no physician could name. He survived, but his voice never returned in full. He spoke in a rasp for the rest of his days. The incident silenced the dormitories. Even among the faculty, a quiet divide began to form. Some argued that Armand was a gift, a priest whose intellect and presence would elevate Willow's reputation. Others whispered caution, that his philosophy stretched too far, that his presence unnerved too many. But ambition spoke louder than fear. The seminary, like all institutions, longed for prestige, and prestige had arrived cloaked in cassock and mystery. Thomas Hale did not share his peers' dread. For him, every peculiarity was proof of Armand's depth. Perhaps science could not yet explain his presence, but was that not the nature of discovery? To confront the inexplicable until it yielded to understanding. He began attending every lecture, filling his journals with notes not only of Armand's words, but of his silences, his pauses, the way his eyes lingered on certain students, as though weighing their souls. Hale's fascination grew into something deeper, not devotion, not yet fear, but a need to know. And so, beneath the spires of Willow, where faith and science had long contended for dominance, a new question began to stir. A question whispered in corridors, written in the margins of notebooks, carried in the uneasy rhythm of prayer. What kind of priest had science itself failed to explain? The days following Father Mathieu's arrival settled like damp fog upon Willow Seminary. His presence lingered in every corridor, an unshakable impression pressed upon stone and memory alike. Though weeks had not yet passed, it felt to the students as though he had always been there, as though the seminary itself had been waiting for him, its vaulted ceilings eager to echo his voice. Each morning he lectured in the great hall, his figure silhouetted against the high windows. His words wove scripture with anatomy, psalms with the language of nerves and marrow. The body is not a vessel for the soul, he told them, his voice deep and strangely resonant. It is the bridge. Flesh, sinew, thought, memory, all bound by cords unseen. When the bridge falters, the soul is not lost. It simply waits, hovering at the threshold. Students shifted uneasily at such talk, yet few looked away. Even the most skeptical found themselves listening, caught between horror and awe. Thomas Hale sat near the front, a notebook open, though his pen often stilled mid-sentence. He had come to Willow Seminary, not for theology, but for medicine, drawn by the institution's unique fusion of faith and science. He believed in proof, in what the eye could see and the hand could measure. But listening to Father Mathieu was like standing before a man who saw beneath the skin, not with scalpel or microscope, but with something older, something primal. Mathieu spoke of wounds no surgeon could close, grief that scarred deeper than bone, guilt that spread through families like hereditary disease. His voice gave shape to things Thomas had felt but never named. It unsettled him more than any medical lecture ever had. Yet there was no denying the unease Mathieu inspired in others. When he passed through the cloisters, conversations faltered. Some students claimed the air around him grew colder, that candles near his chair burned with a weaker flame. A few whispered he carried the scent of damp earth, as though he had risen not from a parish, but from the ground itself. Still, it was not words or whispers that carved Mathieu's place into seminary legend, but what happened one evening in the chapel. It was the hour of Compline, the final prayers before the silence of night. The chapel was dim, lit only by oil lamps that trembled against the stone. The voices of students rose in uneven chant, the young striving to sound solemn, the older weary with repetition. Father Mathieu stood among them, his head bowed, lips moving though no one could hear his words. Then, a sound broke the prayer, not him, but choking. One of the younger boys, no more than 16, clutched his chest and collapsed. His lips turned blue, his eyes bulged with terror as his body convulsed on the floor. Chaos erupted. Students cried out, some rushing to his side, others paralyzed in horror. The rector shouted for aid. Thomas, trained in medicine, pushed through the crowd, his hands trembling but steady enough to tilt the boy's head back, to try and free the throat. Yet there was no obstruction. The boy's lungs strained as though filled with water, though no water was there. His gasps rattled the air, harsh and wet. It was then that Father Mathieu stepped forward. He knelt beside the boy, not with the measured haste of a physician, but with the quiet certainty of one who already knew the outcome. Placing one hand upon the boy's chest, he closed his eyes. His lips moved, but no prayer could be heard. Thomas froze, his rational mind battling against the sight. He wanted to intervene, to push Mathieu away and apply the methods of medicine, but something, fear, awe, or both, held him still. Moments passed like hours. Then, with a sudden convulsion, the boy arched his back and gasped, drawing in air with a sound like breaking surface after drowning. His skin flushed red, his lips regained color. Within seconds, his breathing steadied, though his eyes remained wide, fixed upon Mathieu with something between gratitude and terror. Silence fell heavy upon the chapel. Even the oil lamp seemed to burn lower, as if the air itself had thickened. Reverend Alden, voice unsteady, whispered, "A miracle." Dr. Edward Ashcombe, standing at the rear, barked in reply, "Trickery." The boy suffered a seizure, nothing more. This man exploits the ignorant. Arguments erupted, the faculty divided between awe and skepticism. Some students crossed themselves, tears streaming down their faces. Others looked at Mathieu with suspicion, muttering that what they had witnessed was no act of God but something far darker. Father Mathieu himself said nothing. He only rose slowly, his face unreadable, and returned to his place as though nothing had happened. His silence was more chilling than any proclamation. That night the seminary did not sleep easily. Thomas lay awake in his narrow bed, his mind storming with doubt. He replayed the scene again and again, seeking an explanation. He had studied the mechanics of the lungs, the function of the diaphragm, the intricacies of suffocation and revival. None of it accounted for what he had seen. A boy who had been moments from death had risen, restored by nothing more than the touch of a gaunt priest whose very presence unsettled him. And yet Thomas could not deny the truth. He had seen it with his own eyes. In the days that followed, whispers grew. Some called Matthew a saint, a vessel of divine power sent to Willow to heal both body and soul. Others muttered of witchcraft, of bargains struck in shadowed places. The seminary became a place of quiet division, belief and suspicion battling beneath its aged roof. Thomas found himself torn. He wanted to trust in reason, to dismiss the event as hysteria, coincidence, or the result of some hidden trick. Yet part of him felt drawn closer, pulled by a gravity he could not resist. Was it faith, or was it fear disguised as wonder? Late one evening, he confessed his confusion to Matthew himself. "I don't stir understand," Thomas admitted, his voice hushed. "What you did, it wasn't set medicine, and it wasn't set a prayer. What was it?" Matthew looked at him with those hollow, endless eyes. "It was a bridge," he said softly. "Nothing more. The soul had wandered, the flesh faltered. I merely brought them together again." Thomas shivered. He did not know whether he had heard truth or blasphemy. In the days that followed, he would return often to that phrase, a bridge. What did it mean? And what did it cost to build? Because in Willow Seminary nothing was ever given freely. The days after the chapel incident carried a strange heaviness, as though the seminary itself had drawn breath and held it. The boy who had collapsed returned to his lessons, pale but alive, his every glance shadowed by an unspoken terror. He never spoke of what he felt on that night, nor of the hands that drew him back from the brink. And perhaps it was his silence that gave life to something worse, whispers. At first they were only words spoken in the dormitories, exchanged in the corridors, passed between students whose faith burned brighter than their reason. They spoke of Father Matthew as though he were not a man, but a vessel, a prophet sent in flesh. One said he had seen Matthew walking the cloisters without casting a shadow. Another swore he heard the man praying in Latin one moment and answering him in perfect English the next, though Matthew's lips had never moved. The seminary, built of stone and discipline, had long stood as a place where order reigned. Its walls had contained centuries of restless youth, their fervor tempered by the steady hand of faith and study. But now something had shifted. Students no longer muttered doubts over theology or argued over science versus scripture. Instead, they whispered of miracles and curses, of light in Matthew's presence and sickness in his absence. And then the walls themselves began to whisper. At night, doors creaked open with no hand upon them. Voices carried through the empty cloisters, half-heard chants, the murmur of prayers recited in languages no one recognized. Some students claimed they were awoken by figures standing at the foot of their beds, figures whose features dissolved like smoke when lamps were lit. Thomas Hale resisted such fears as best he could. He clung to the rational, telling himself these were tricks of fatigue, the fevered imagination of boys, desperate to believe they lived in extraordinary days. And yet, even he could not deny what he saw. Those who sat closest to Father Matthew, who hung upon his every word, began to look ill. Their skin grew pale, their eyes sunken, their lips chapped as though drained of vitality. They spoke less, moved slower, yet clung more tightly to the priest's presence, as if feeding upon him, or being fed upon by something through him. Conversely, those who doubted Matthew did not fare better. A young student who mocked Matthew behind his back was discovered with a shattered arm after a fall from the bell tower. Another who had confronted him openly in the lecture hall collapsed days later with a sudden seizure, never to return to his studies. Then came Professor Grayson. He had taught philosophy at Willow for 30 years, his stern hand a steadying presence for countless students. When asked of Matthew, he had declared the man dangerous, a manipulator, no priest at all. Days later, he was found dead in his chambers, slumped at his desk, his face frozen in a mask of horror so profound it seemed to mock death itself. His eyes bulged, his mouth stretched in silent scream, his pen still poised above parchment where his last word remained unfinished. The seminary reeled. Officially, his death was ascribed to natural causes, but few believed it. Students muttered of curses. Faculty fell into tense divisions, and in the silence between, the walls whispered louder. It was then that Thomas sought out Clara. She had been his companion since childhood, a friend whose sharp mind and skeptical spirit had often steered him from folly. While he remained at Willow, she pursued her studies at the women's college in the nearby town, excelling in languages and history. He trusted her judgment, and in this season of fear, her presence felt like the last stable ground. They met in the library garden, away from the ears of his fellow students. Mist hung low across the hedges, muffling their words. "You stir pale, Thomas," she said softly, scanning his face, "and you carry something in your eyes you never had before." "It's this place," he admitted. "Something seeps wrong within it. Since Father Mathieu arrived, Willow feels different, heavier, like the stones themselves are listening." Clara studied him closely. "And what of the priest?" Thomas hesitated. "He saved a boy Sep's life, yet those who draw near to him weaken, those who doubt him fall to illness or worse. I cannot say if it is miracle or curse, but it is not natural." She touched his sleeve, her voice steady. "Then you must look behind him. A man Sep's works may deceive, but his past cannot." He swallowed. "I have searched. There is nothing. His parish records are absent. No baptism, no ordination, no trace before this year. It is as though he stepped out of the mist itself, fully formed, and walked into Willow Sit's halls." Clara frowned, her brow furrowed. "Men do not simply appear, Thomas. He has roots somewhere, but if they are hidden, ask yourself, who hid them, and why?" Her words struck him, for he realized she was right. It was not absence he had found in Mathieu's past, but erasure, and erasure spoke of intent. That night, as Thomas returned to the seminary, he could not shake the feeling that every shadow clung to him more tightly than before. In the refectory, students sat with faces pale and eyes fixed upon Mathieu as though he were the only light in the world. When Mathieu passed, they bowed their heads, some crossing themselves, others simply watching with a hunger that unsettled Thomas more than any miracle. And then, as he lay in bed sleepless, he heard it, whispers in the walls, soft but distinct, his name, spoken not once, but again and again, as though the stones themselves knew him. "Thomas." He pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound was within him as much as without. The seminary, once a place of study, had become a vessel of suspicion. Students eyed one another not as brothers, but as conspirators. Faculty muttered behind closed doors, some swayed by belief, others by fear. And in the chapel, incense hung so thick, it felt like smothering fog, each breath heavy, each prayer hollow. Thomas wondered if Willow Seminary was unraveling or if it was not unraveling at all, but being rewoven into something else, something darker. And though he clung to Clara Sip's counsel, he could not silence the thought that grew louder with each passing night. If Father Mathieu had no past, then what was he? Night at Willow Seminary was never truly silent. The timbers creaked with their own memories, the wind threaded through its ancient stones, and somewhere deep below the earth, a presence seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the buried past. But after Father Mathieu arrived, those whispers turned into something else. The students spoke of gatherings, not in the daylight, not before the altar where prayers were once recited with trembling lips. No, these meetings were whispered about in corridors, exchanged between pale faces as though the words themselves might betray them. Mathieu had begun to summon them at night into the chapel, where no bell tolled, where the moon's light filtered only in fractured beams across the stained glass. They went willingly. At first, Thomas thought it was only the weak-minded, those desperate for approval, or eager to taste something forbidden. But soon he noticed others, the studious, The devout, even those who once resisted Matthew's dark charisma, slipping through the halls after midnight, drawn to him like moths to a flame. And always, they returned changed. Their eyes shimmered with a glassy brightness. Their voices carried a tremor, as if they had stood before something not meant for mortal sight. They spoke in riddles of visions of marrow burning with divine fire, of veils torn aside, of a God who did not dwell in heaven but beneath the skin of creation. Thomas resisted. He had resisted from the first moment Matthew entered the seminary, with his strange sermons and his shadow of authority. Yet resistance became its own form of isolation. He began to feel the walls closing, the air thickening with a fever that did not belong to him. One night when the chanting began again, low at first, then swelling until it rattled the dormitory windows, Thomas could endure it no longer. He dressed quickly, each button trembling beneath his fingers, and slipped into the corridor. The sound guided him like a trail, through stone passages, down staircases where the torches seemed dimmer than they had been hours before, until at last he came to the chapel doors. The wood vibrated under his hand. The sound inside was not human. He pressed his ear against the cold oak. Voices rose in unison, merging into one chord, one endless drone that seemed to bore through the marrow of his bones. It was not Latin. It was not Greek. It was not any tongue he had heard, yet some part of him understood. A prayer without words, a plea older than scripture. Thomas pushed the door open. The chapel was unrecognizable. Candles burned not at the altar, but along the walls, forming a circle of flame. Within that circle knelt the students, their bodies swaying as though moved by unseen tides. Their faces glistened with sweat, eyes rolled back, lips trembling as they repeated the chant. And at the center stood Matthew. His cassock flowed like a shroud, arms outstretched. The candlelight flickered not upon him but around him, as though refusing to touch. His voice was not raised, yet every student echoed him perfectly, their tones melting into a vibration that shook the very air. Thomas tried to breathe quietly, but the sound caught in his throat. Then Matthew moved. With a deliberate slowness, he unfastened the buttons of his cassock, one by one, until the fabric fell open across his chest. Thomas staggered back. There was no heartbeat, no rise and fall of breath. Instead, a pulsing core of light and shadow, interwoven, beating not with rhythm but with hunger. It writhed beneath the skin, as though something inside was pressing against its prison, something alive, something waiting. The students fell forward, foreheads striking the stone floor. Their chant grew wild, desperate, as though begging to be devoured. Thomas gripped the pew, his nails splintering the wood. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet his body would not obey. He stared into that chest, into that impossible fusion of radiance and void, and for a moment he felt it look back. Not Matthew's eyes, but the thing within him. And then Matthew raised his head. His gaze pierced the circle of bodies cutting through candlelight and fell upon Thomas. He smiled. The voice entered not through the ears, but through the marrow, a whisper that crawled into his skull and made its home there. "You too will see." The chant collapsed into silence. Thomas stumbled backward. The doors behind him seemed impossibly far. The chapel spun, the air thickening with incense that smelled not of sanctity but of rot and roses. He turned, finally breaking free of the paralysis, and ran. His footsteps echoed against stone, a frantic drum against the silence he had left behind. Yet even as he fled through the corridor, he could still hear Matthew's whisper, lodged like a seed within him. "You too will see." He burst into the night air, collapsing against the cold stone of the outer wall. The stars swam above him, distorted, as though the heavens themselves recoiled from what had been unveiled. He tried to pray, but the words curdled on his tongue. What God could hear him now? Which heaven remained untouched, uncorrupted, unswallowed by the thing that lived within Matthew's breast? And worse, he knew he was no longer safe. Mathieu had seen him, not just with eyes, but with something deeper, something that pierced to the soul. He was marked. The seminary was no longer divided. It was being consumed. Thomas pressed his hands over his ears, but it was no use. He could still hear the chant beneath his skin, vibrating through his blood, an echo that was not his own. He could still see the flicker of that chest, the light, the shadow, the unnameable thing waiting within. And though he whispered to himself that he would resist, that he would flee, that he would never return to that chapel again, another truth lingered. The whisper was right. One day he would see. Panic had once been whispered at Willow Seminary. A shadow under the breath, a tremor behind locked doors. But now it walked openly through the corridors, brazen and unashamed, moving from mouth to mouth like contagion. Faculty vanished, not in silence, but in spectacle. Their offices, when opened, no longer resembled places of study. Shelves were overturned, quills snapped, ledgers scattered across the floor as though some frantic hand had rifled through them in search of something not listed in any index. Inkwells toppled, bleeding dark stains into sermons and treatises. In one chamber, a black cassock hung still upon its peg, yet its owner had dissolved from the world as though stripped away mid-sentence. Students dared not speak of these absences aloud, though their eyes betrayed the truth. Willow was hollowing, its body was thinning, ribs poking out, sinew tearing under an invisible strain. The seminary was no longer a vessel for faith, it was becoming something else. Dr. Ashcombe, who had once lectured with the sharpness of iron, now shuffled listlessly through the halls. His eyes, dimmed of recognition, stared only inward. His lips moved ceaselessly, muttering fragments of Mathieu's voice. The marrow remembers. The marrow consents. Faith is sinew. Faith binds. Students parted before him like reeds in a current, watching as the proud mind was reduced to a husk echoing borrowed phrases. His decline was not pitiable alone, it was contagious, as though submission were a fever. Reverend Alden, however, did not see decay but fulfillment. He stood upon the pulpit with arms raised, declaring with a voice cracked by exaltation, "Do you not feel it? The Spirit descends again. Willow is chosen. This is our Pentecost. Tongues shall burn, flesh shall speak, and the living temple shall rise from marrow and breath." His congregation did not cheer. They listened with wide eyes, half convinced, half terrified, unable to discern whether this was revelation or delirium. Yet in their silence was a seed, faith bending, faith fracturing. Amid this unraveling, Thomas and Clara sought one another like survivors in a storm. Though shadows crept through the halls, though the seminary seemed to pulse with an unseen heart, their alliance remained a thread of sanity. Clara's face had thinned, her hands smudged with the dust of archives rifled through, yet her eyes retained a fierce, desperate clarity. "We cannot simply watch as they vanish," she whispered, her voice breaking in the echoing refectory. "If we do nothing, Willow will devour itself, and we with it." Thomas nodded, though his own resolve was faltering. Every corridor whispered Mathieu's name, every door seemed to breathe when shut. But fear had long ago ceased to be his master. They chose their path not toward safety but toward the heart of danger. Together, by lamplight, they entered Mathieu's quarters. The chamber was not abandoned. It was arranged. Journals lay in ordered stacks, yet each bore the marks of obsession, margins thick with annotations, lines of scripture bent until meaning snapped. Thomas opened one, its ink smudged with fingerprints, and found words that seemed neither wholly sacred nor wholly human. The text wove psalms with anatomy, as though prayer were muscle to be dissected, scripture a vein to be sutured. Prayers bled into surgical instructions, in sears along the faithless flesh, bind marrow to belief. The vessel consents when broken. Page after page offered not devotion, but preparation. and in the margins, diagrams of bone and sinew were marked with verses inverted, twisted into imperatives. The tongue must speak though it be not the tongue of men. The body must kneel, though sinew resists. The marrow remembers. Clara recoiled, clutching the candle, as if its flame alone could guard her soul. "This is not theology," she whispered. "It is ritual. He is dissecting the body, as though it were liturgy itself." Thomas, though shaken, read further. His eyes caught upon one phrase repeated like a refrain across the pages: "Until the altar breathes, the vessel is unready." It was then that the truth fell heavy upon him. Matthew was not preaching, he was preparing. The seminary itself, its stones, its chambers, its trembling bodies, was being fashioned into something unholy. Not a sanctuary, but an altar. Thomas closed the journal, his hand trembling against the cover. The silence of the room pressed upon him, thick with the residue of Matthew's intent. He looked to Clara, her face pale, yet resolute. "We are not safe here," he murmured. "Willow is no longer a place of learning. It is becoming his sacrifice." The words tasted of ash. The seminary they had once revered, the halls where hymns had risen, now carried the pulse of something older and hungrier than God. Yet Claricep's voice did not waver. "Then we must choose flee or resist. To remain blind is to consent. To speak is to risk silence forever." Outside, the corridors groaned as though timbers shifted under unseen weight. Somewhere, the faint echo of Reverend Alden Sepp's voice carried, "The Spirit descends, the altar readies." Thomas felt the question burning not only in his mind, but in the marrow of all who yet resisted. If faith itself could be twisted into flesh, if sanctuary could become sacrifice, then what remained untouched? What altar, if any, was still safe within us? And to you listening now, if the house you trusted most began to breathe like a body, to hunger like a mouth, would you still kneel at its altar, or would you run knowing that faith itself might be the blade? The night of reckoning arrived not with thunder, but with silence so profound that even the stones of Willow seemed to hold their breath. The seminary had long been a place of ritual, prayers chanted at dawn, hymns echoing at dusk, a cadence of devotion etched into its marrow. But this night, that cadence broke. Something older and darker stirred, calling all who remained to the chapel. The chapel glowed with hundreds of candles, their flames guttering in uneasy rhythm, as if reluctant to bear witness. Wax dripped like blood upon the altar rail, hardening in grotesque rivulets along the worn oak. The air itself thickened with heat and the copper tang of expectation. One by one, Matthew's followers entered, eyes vacant, mouths parted in reverent awe. They filled the pews not as worshippers, but as supplicants. Reverend Alden stood near the pulpit, his once paternal frame now gaunt with fervor, lips quivering as he muttered fragments of scripture, bent and twisted into proclamations of surrender. The students too shuffled forward in silence, their bodies trembling not with fear, but with hunger for the promise whispered to them in the night. Transcendence. At the center stood Matthew. His presence no longer resembled a man's. He wore the cassock of a priest, yet it seemed to hang upon him as if unwilling to cling to a thing so mutable. His voice, when he began to speak, was both tender and terrible, a lullaby stretched across the rack of eternity. "Children of marrow," he intoned, hands lifted as though conducting the flames themselves. "The body is but clay, the soul but spark. Tonight we abandon the prison of flesh and embrace the marrow eternal, the sinew of God, the covenant of bone. By wound and offering the altar lives." The congregation swayed as though the words themselves were wine. Their faces, illuminated by trembling candlelight, revealed no skepticism. They were entranced, as though each syllable burrowed into their marrow, rearranging belief. And then, as though on cue, the first student drew a blade. A shallow cut across the palm, crimson welling forth, dripping into a great basin set at the foot of the altar. One after another followed, their blood mingling in a dark pool that reflected the wavering flames like a black mirror. The scent of iron rose, sharp and sweet, filling the air until breath itself felt heavy with sacrifice. Clara Bell's gasp broke the trance. She clutched Thomas Bell's sleeve, her voice a desperate whisper. If this continues, there will be nothing left of them. He will drain them, body and soul. Thomas F's heart thundered, yet he forced his legs to carry him forward. He climbed the chancel steps, voice trembling but resolute. Stop this madness. Can you not see what he is? This is no offering to God. It is desecration. For a moment, silence broke the spell. Some students faltered, blades trembling in their hands, but Matthew only turned toward Thomas, his lips curling into a smile that was less human than hunger. Do you speak of desecration? Matthew Sev's voice rang like a bell cracked down its middle. I offer them freedom. You would chain them to dust. Flesh is frailty, Thomas, but marrow is covenant eternal. Would you deny them eternity for the sake of your trembling fear? Clara stepped beside Thomas, her candle raised like a fragile weapon. Eternity built on blood is not salvation. It is damnation. At this, Matthew laughed. Not the laughter of a man, but the sound of riven timbers groaning under fire. His form shuddered, rippling as though skin were but water stretched too thin. Before their eyes, flesh bent as though bones were clay. His chest bulged, split, and opened, not in light but in darkness. From within, a pulsing mass revealed itself, not heart, not organ, but something unnameable. It throbbed with the rhythm of countless voices, inhaling the very air, drawing breath from the lungs of all present. Students staggered, gasping as though their souls were being siphoned with every pulse. The congregation cried out, yet not in fear, in ecstasy. Transcendence. Reverend Alden screamed, falling to his knees. The marrow eternal, the covenant revealed. The ritual swelled. The basin of blood trembled, ripples coursing across its surface as if stirred by an unseen hand. Candles flared violently, their flames stretching long, casting shadows that writhed like serpents upon the chapel walls. The ground itself began to quake. Stones shifted underfoot, pews groaned and splintered, glass shattered in the tall windows, cascading shards like icy rain. The very architecture of Willow trembled, as though the seminary, long a sanctuary, could no longer contain what had been summoned. Thomas staggered, clutching the edge of the altar. He felt the marrow deep pull, the seduction of surrender. A whisper wormed into his mind. Kneel, and you will never die. Played, and you will never break. For one shuddering moment, he believed it. But Clarice's hand found his, anchoring him to breath, to flesh, to fear. Her voice, though choked, rose above the frenzy. Thomas, resist him. If we yield, Willow becomes his temple forever. The faithful screamed, some collapsing in ecstasy, others clawing their own skin as though desperate to shed their bodies. Matthew's form loomed above them, chest still open, the pulsing mass gorging itself on their cries, their breath, their blood. The air bent under its hunger, each inhalation threatening to crush bone and spirit alike. The ritual was no longer ceremony. It was crescendo. Every brick, every beam of Willow vibrated with the force of something being born. The seminary, Thomas realized, was not only altar, it was womb, and something within Matthew sought to emerge. The chapel had never felt more alive, and yet never so close to death. The air was a furnace of incense and smoke, thick with the metallic sting of blood. Students writhed upon the floorboards, their pale hands clawing at their own skin, as if trying to peel something unseen away. Candles guttered, their flames bending toward the altar where Matthew stood. No, where something wearing Matthew's face presided. His voice was no longer a sermon but a command, a vibration that rattled teeth and bones alike. Empty yourselves, he intoned, his throat swollen with unnatural resonance. Abandon the prison of flesh. Let your marrow be mine, and in me, eternal. A boy fell to the ground with a hollow thud. His chest had caved in, ribs folding inward as though sucked dry. Another convulsed, his limbs bending in grotesque arcs, tendons snapping like strings pulled too taut. The air reeked of iron and rot, of sweat and decay, and the chapel, once a sanctuary, had become a crucible. Thomas stood at the rear, horror freezing him. He had thought Mathieu a deceiver, a mad priest intoxicated with visions. But this was no man. He saw it now, plainly, a parasite clothed in scripture, a hunger masquerading as holiness. Mathieu was not drinking blood, not even the soul. He was feeding on the raw marrow of belief itself, reshaping devotion into substance, flesh into his own grotesque image. Clara clutched Thomas Sip's arm, her eyes wide and wet. "We have to stop him," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the rising tide of screams. He sips, devouring them. Thomas's mind raced. The journals, the scrawled warnings, the sigils etched into the margins of scripture. They had spoken of unbinding, not salvation, not redemption, but denial. Not an offering, but a refusal. He whispered the thought aloud. If he feeds on belief, then to starve him we must destroy it. Clara Sepp's eyes flashed with understanding, though fear followed quickly. Destroy faith itself. Here in a chapel, another body collapsed, face slack, eyes still glistening with the last spark of devotion. Thomas swallowed his terror. Not destroy faith, just unbind it, break its hold on him. If belief is the tether, then disbelief is the knife. Together they stumbled forward, forcing their way through bodies that trembled and shook. Students clawed at them, some reaching for Thomas as if he were a lifeline, others pushing them back with vacant eyes, entranced by Mathieu's promise. At the altar, Mathieu's body twisted like molten wax, his skin splitting at the seams to reveal marrow-white ridges of bone beneath. His chest opened like a second mouth, ribs unfolding into a cathedral of flesh. From within, voices chorused in dozens of languages, crying prayers, curses, pleas for mercy. It was the sound of centuries of faith, stolen and bound into a single devouring throat. Thomas tore open the journal, his hands shaking. The words swam before him, ink bleeding into symbols that bent the eyes to look upon. Clara steadied him, pressing her palm over his. Together they spoke, not prayers, not hymns, but words of denial, syllables of unbinding. We do not believe. The words cut through the air like a blade. The chapel shuddered. Candles went dark, one by one, their smoke rising like the spirits of the dead. The students froze mid-convulsion, their eyes snapping open with fear and clarity. Mathieu roared, his voice no longer human but cavernous, a pit with no bottom. Silence. His form convulsed, warping, as though his own body could not decide what shape it should hold. Do not abandon me. I am your marrow, your breath, your eternity. But Thomas and Clara pressed on. They recited the sigils, each syllable a hammer against the invisible chains that bound the followers to him. We do not believe. We do not bind. We are free. The students screamed, torn between the ecstasy of surrender and the agony of awakening. Some fell limp, their faces slack with peace, as if unshackled at last. Others convulsed harder, their bodies snapping as Mathieu's tether tried to hold them. Blood streaked across the floorboards, forming rivers that led back to the altar. And Mathieu's form began to collapse inward. The marrow-white ridges of bone shriveled, sucking into themselves. His skin bubbled and tore, collapsing into a hollow shell that folded upon itself like paper set aflame. His eyes, once burning with false divinity, now flickered with a desperate animal hunger. "Do not leave me," he howled, voice cracking into the wail of a starving child. "I was your priest, your guide, your light." Thomas shouted back, his voice breaking, "You were nothing but a parasite, and we are done feeding you." The words struck like a hammer on glass. The stained windows burst, shards raining inward with a sound like 1,000 bells. The roof groaned, wood splitting under the pressure of unraveling faith. The chapel itself seemed to deny its existence, walls buckling and floors bowing, as if reality could no longer hold the weight of such belief. Students clutched their ears, their mouths, their hearts screaming as the bonds broke within them. Some wailed like infants. Others fell into silence, but all were caught in the tearing storm of belief unmade. Clara kept her voice steady, chanting the sigils until her throat bled. Thomas joined her, even as his own vision blurred, the words searing themselves into his flesh like scars. Matthew's body convulsed once more, then imploded, collapsing into a heap of marrow dust that scattered with the wind. Silence followed. Not peace, not triumph, but the silence of something broken beyond repair. The chapel groaned one last time, beams snapping like bones before it fell into ruin around them. Thomas stood amid the wreckage, his chest heaving, his hands stained with the ink of denial and the blood of the fallen. Around him, the students stirred weakly, some alive, others gone, all forever marked. Clara touched his shoulder, her face streaked with tears. "It's over." But Thomas could not answer. He stared at the ashes where Matthew had stood, wondering if such a being ever truly died, or if denial was only another form of belief, feeding the void in ways they could not yet see. And then came the question that would haunt them both. If faith itself can be turned into a weapon, into something that feeds and consumes, then what do we risk every time we choose to believe? The dawn was cruel. It rose not with warmth, nor with promise, but with a pale indifference that stretched across the ruined seminary like a funeral shroud. Mist clung low to the ground, veiling the broken bodies that lay scattered among the splintered pews. The chapel, once proud in its Gothic bones, was now a gutted carcass, its ribs of stone and wood exposed to the light of morning. The survivors, those few who had not been drained into silence, stumbled out into the courtyard. Their faces were grey, hollow, their eyes staring at nothing. Some clutched at their throats as though words had been stolen from them. Others whispered fragments of hymns, voices breaking, no longer certain whether they prayed to God or to the thing that had devoured them. Faith had become poison. Thomas stood amidst the ruin, his hands trembling, the journal still clutched against his chest, though its pages were soaked with ash and blood. Clara was beside him, silent, her gaze fixed on the rubble where Matthew's form had collapsed. Yet even as the morning light touched that spot, neither of them felt certain it was gone. For what is absence if not another form of presence? What is silence if not another voice waiting to be heard? The air still carried the echo of his sermon, a low vibration, as if the stones themselves remembered him. Thomas closed his eyes, but behind them he saw the marrow-white ridges, the chest splitting open, the endless hunger crying out, "Do not leave me." Clara whispered at last, "We survived." But the words rang hollow. Survival was not triumph. Survival was exile. They had not overcome Matthew through strength or faith. They had not outsmarted him with reason. They had survived only by tearing themselves loose from both. The twin tethers of belief and logic that had once defined them, in their unbinding, they had become untethered. And untethered souls are little more than ghosts waiting for their graves. Weeks passed. The chapel was declared unsafe, its ruins fenced off. The seminary limped on, its corridors emptied of laughter, its halls echoing only with the shuffle of half-broken students. Some left at once, too haunted to remain. Others lingered, unwilling to let go of the only structure they had ever known. But in the end, Willow closed its doors. The spires darkened, windows shattered, and ivy crawled across the stones like veins reclaiming a corpse. The air grew heavy with moss and silence, and the grounds became a place avoided rather than revered. Locals whispered of what had happened. Few knew the truth. Fewer still wanted to. They spoke instead of chants carried on the wind when the fog was thickest, of faint cries that rose from the ruins of the chapel. Some swore they had seen him, the priest, hollow-eyed, wandering among the graves, his lips moving as though still preaching. Others said they had heard their own names carried on the mist, as if something remembered them. Children dared one another to step onto the grounds at dusk. None lasted long. And Thomas, he did not remain. His hands, once steady with books and study, now shook too violently to hold a pen. He had lost his calling, but worse than that, he had lost the compass of his soul. Science, which had once given him certainty, felt fragile now, a paper wall against the storm. Faith, which had promised comfort, felt toxic, a door that opened only to cages. He wandered, carrying the journal, though he no longer read from it. Clara stayed longer. She walked the grounds at dawn, when the mist was low and the silence deepest. She would place her hand on the stones of the ruined chapel, listening. She claimed she did not hear him, that the whispers were only wind, but sometimes Thomas thought he saw her lips move, as though answering. Together, yet apart, they bore their guilt. Survivors not by virtue, but by vacancy. They had cut themselves free, but in doing so had severed every anchor. Years passed and Willow Seminary became nothing more than a shadow in local law, a ruin draped in ivy, where trespassers dared not linger. Travelers on the old road swore the bell tower, though gutted and empty, sometimes tolled once at midnight, a single, hollow chime that carried across the valley. And still the question remained. Was Matthew truly gone? Or had the unbinding not destroyed him, but only scattered him, waiting for belief to take root again? For isn't belief eternal in the human heart, whether in gods, in reason, or in the darkness between? Thomas, waking at night, would sometimes feel the echo of a voice in his chest, not in his ears, not in his mind, but in his marrow, a hunger that was not his own. Clara, staring into the mist, sometimes whispered a prayer without knowing whose name it called. And so Willow stood, hollow, abandoned, yet alive in ways no living thing should be. The chants drifted still, carried by winds that should have been silent. The figure was glimpsed still, hollow-eyed, waiting not for blood, not for flesh, but for the one inexhaustible nourishment of man, belief. And in the silence of Willow, only one question remains, unanswered and unanswerable. If science could not explain him, and faith could not contain him, then what was Father Matthew Armand?